What role do universities or medical schools play? Do they have all the correct, accurate information and tell the doctors perfectly accurate information, or what role? Because I'm under the impression that the medical schools have the most accurate information and the universities do the best research. So what's the reality?
Well, medical school is not an entity that has the information. Who has the information? The professors at the medical school, the faculty at the medical school. I'm on the staff of a med school, of the Harvard Medical School. And I mentor students, and I mentor junior researchers, and I help plan research. And I can't fault Harvard as an institution on this at all. I have colleagues who do research that I admire a lot. And the one thing that I do know is that the research that is done has to be funded. And it's not funded by the university. It's funded by other agencies, and it might be funded, some of it's funded by the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Mental Health, various NIH institutes. Some of it is funded by the drug companies. And the results of the clinical trials seem to vary as a function of who is doing the funding. Here's what we know about that when it comes to antidepressants, which is the area that I am most familiar with. I think this is just this might be psychotropics in general. I have to look that back up again. But with industry-funded trials, now let's say it's just antidepressants for the moment. With industry-funded trials, 75% of the trials show positive results for the drug that was tested. With independently funded trials, 50% show positive results. That's in published trials. Then there are trials that have been funded by a competitor. So this might be a comparator trial, and the manufacturer of drug A does a trial comparing their drug to a drug of a competitor, a different manufacturer. Only 25% of the trials show a positive effect for a drug that is not funded, that's funded by a different, was funded by a competitor, from a trial that's funded by a competitor. So who funds the trial seems to have a substantial outcome on the outcome of the trial, at least of the aggregate trials, are the ones that get published.
I think this is really an important point. So who do we put our faith in as a people? I don't really think we should have faith in the drug companies. And in a way, the drug companies are for-profit companies, and they have an obligation to the shareholders to try to maximize profits, et cetera. So you can understand I'm not going to pardon it, but you can sort of understand the behavior of drug companies. We put our faith in the academic medical schools. That's the group that really is supposed to be beholden to the public and not beholden to the pharmaceutical industry. And a couple of things have happened over the past 30 years. One, we did get something called the Bayh-Dole Act. I think it was 1980, something like that, 1982, which was meant to foster more collaboration between academic medical schools and pharmaceutical companies. And one of the, if I have this act right, before this act, if you were funded by the NIH and you made a discovery, that discovery was seen as part of the public good, okay? So you couldn't license that discovery to an individual drug company because it was funded by the public. But after the Bayh-Dole Act, you could get funding from the NIH, make a discovery, and then the medical school could license that discovery to the pharmaceutical company for development as a drug. And this began fostering this greater collaboration between industry and the academic medical schools. In addition, there was some trouble getting funding, so increasingly during the 80s, NIH funding became harder to obtain, et cetera, that academic medical schools look to foster closer collaborations with the medical schools than they had before. And when I was doing that company I mentioned about, pharmaceutical companies noticed this change, and they talked about how prior to the mid-1980s or even later, they used to, when they wanted their studies, when they wanted their drugs tested in clinical trials, and they needed academic medical people to be authors to lend those studies legitimacy, they would go to the academic leaders, and they would sort of have to beg. They would say, they told me, like with hat in hand, because the academic medical guys looked down on the drug company funded studies. The real coin of the realm was the NIH studies. But then as a result of the change where academic medical schools now started changing drug money, the power switched to the pharmaceutical companies. And they could go to academic medical schools and go to the academic professors, and they would say, take it or leave it now. And one of the things that happened as this power switched, it used to be the doctors, academic medical doctors, would insist on A, designing the trials, and B, having an ability to actually examine the data and report on the data. Under the new system, that no longer was true. They had to sign off on studies that were designed by the pharmaceutical companies, and they could design it in these biased ways, and they would also analyze the data. And as part of the switch, really what you had was the academic medical people, particularly in psychiatry, sort of lending credibility to the studies, but they weren't really doing the studies anymore. It was a fabrication. And the other thing that happened, particularly in psychiatry, as this switch happened, is the drug companies now began paying academic psychiatrists big dollars to be their advisors, consultants, that sort of thing, not just do the trials. Now, the minute they hire academic psychiatrists to be advisors, consultants, speakers, and we're talking big money, under the Charles Grassley probe, you'd see individual psychiatrists making hundreds of thousands of dollars, $700,000 one person. Joseph Biederman, who helped open up the market for juvenile Risperdal and juvenile bipolar disorder, got $1.6 million from one company, and I think he worked for about 20 different companies. So the other thing that, he also opened up the ADHD market for companies. The point is here, you say we should trust academic medical schools, right? Well, the powers for drug testing, A, shifted to the drug companies. They really gained control. B, medical schools began chasing that money. And C, at least in psychiatry, the profession got bought. Mm-hmm. And by 1998, I think it was, the New England Journal of Medicine tried to find a prominent academic psychiatrist who could do a review of the data to see, are these drugs effective? And they basically had a really difficult time finding anybody who wasn't taking money from pharmaceutical companies. So what happened is we ended up with a compromised, at least in psychiatry, a grossly compromised academic medical community. And in this new book I have, Psychiatry Under the Influence, the corruption actually is in NIMH-funded trials, in some instances, I think is much worse than any of the drug industry-funded trials. And you say, why is that so? And I think it's two reasons. There's A, guild influences present. They want to preserve that one hammer they have. But two, even though they're not being funded, the investigators at that moment, they still have ties to pharmaceutical companies generally as speakers, advisors. So given those ties that may not be present in this individual trial, they're still protecting drug company interests. So this is another big problem we have is the very institution we look for honest information is compromised and corrupted.
I want to add a little thought. I'm going to take a quiz. How many people are pretty clear from everything that's been presented, and probably before you came as well, that there's an immense amount of corruption at every single level? Okay. So we're kind of speaking to the choir. So I'm going to tell a little story to kind of maybe, as we move into conclusion, what to do. So this happened in the 17th century. The head of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov, who was a great spiritual master, but also a great healer. And he lived in this particular town, Mezibo, and a very famous doctor came to town, and the Duchess of the town said, you know, I really want you to meet this healer. And the doctor said, well, what medical school did he go to? No, I didn't go to medical school. He's just a natural healer. So, okay, you insist, I'll meet him. So the Baal Shem Tov comes over and at the Duchess' request, and the first thing the doctor, this very famous doctor, says, well, what medical school did you come? No, I didn't. I learned from God, you know. I learned naturally. And then a few other derogatory things. Well, do you know how to take a pulse? Well, let's see. So I have a very unique pulse. Let's see if you can read my pulse, is what the Baal Shem Tov said. And he said, there is something unique, but I can't figure out what it is. He said, well, it's my yearning for God. It disrupts my pulse. Okay. And he says, let me take your pulse now. And the Baal Shem Tov is taking his pulse, and he's actually quite a famous pulse taker on many levels. He's reading it, and he says to the Duchess, hey, are you missing a gold mirror and a silver comb? Yeah, she said, I just noticed that yesterday. He said, well, according to this pulse, if you go to this doctor's room and where he's staying, it's in his trunk. So, of course, she sends her people there, and, of course, the doctor's caught stealing. And he's kicked out of town in disgrace. So, in essence, we're playing out that story again, right? We're talking about fraud, corruption, and actually damaging people. That's what we're talking about. And just not a small statistic, but more people have died from proper prescribed drugs in the last 10 years than all the people have died in all the wars since the Revolution, 1776. 1.3 million people have died in all the wars, and about 2.25 million people die every 10 years from all the deaths from drugs. Okay, this is a pretty big deal. So I bring the question to you. Baal Shem Tov was pretty clever about it. Well, what are we going to do to expose this system to create some change? Now, we can sit here and we're exposing it, right? But how do we create some changes in the system that can restore some sort of concern for humanity and the healing of humanity? That's really a question. We already agree on the problem. So I want to raise that question, if it's okay, and see what people have to say. Actually,
Dr. Cousens, why don't we take a 5-minute stretch break and come back for part 2 with all 4 of you, and we'll just stretch, and everyone stretch, some water, and we'll come back in 5 minutes for part 2.